Excellent. So it's about just about 2:05, so we don't want to hold everybody up too long.
Yeah.
So if you are a participant today, could you please go ahead and make sure that you are muted for the presentation, and then we'll have be able to do some talking later on, hopefully by the end of the presentation. I also need to start the recording.
It's already, I believe it's already rolling.
Oh, excellent. I was just looking at that. Thank you very much. Wanted to make sure we're recording. And I'd like to introduce everyone to use positive and inclusive language every day. And so I invited a lot of people. If you had done the registration, there was a question whether or not you wanted to participate. And so I'm very glad that I have a lot of colleagues that have joined me today. We have a lot of information, but I'd like to introduce myself. I am Mish McIntyre, instructional designer. So we'll put video on. Mish McIntyre, instructional designer. I am out of the office of the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Rosemary Costigan, who is, I think is here actually in the session today. Yay! And I would like to actually let my colleagues introduce themselves to you as well. Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Robinson. I'm the Interim Director of Disability Services.
Jess?
Hi, I'm Jess Wilkie, Director of Guided Pathways. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Kristen?
I'm Kristen Swithers, over in the biology department, and I want to welcome everybody to our session today.
Fabulous. And Kevin?
My name is Kevin. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm excited. Let's do this.
Yay. I'm so glad everyone could be here today with us. Kevin Salisbury, unfortunately, won't be able to make it today with us. And James Hinsey was only able to make the 1 o'clock. So
I'm actually here
today.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I didn't.
I can skip the stress one for this.
Sure, you are a co-host. Excellent. Great. Major. Thank you, James.
Yep. And I've been in the nursing department for over 20 years now. And I'm currently sitting in the Warwick campus.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I hope everybody was able to see President Hughes's message this morning in some of the sessions. It was a really great message. It touched a lot of what we're going to talk about today, and I encourage you to watch some of the recordings for the first session, so you'll be able to catch that video. What I would like to talk today with you is that I'm not an expert. I am not an expert in diversity, equity, or inclusion. I want to acknowledge my biases. I want to grow in empathy and compassion. I want to be and model inclusiveness. I want to be part of an inclusive community here at the college where we are sharing and valuing each other. I want to share what I have learned on my journey with my community, and I want to hear what others are learning as well. I will continue to make mistakes, and boy, do I make a lot. I hope that you will have compassion and forgive me for whatever happens. And I also want to recognize that we only have about 45 minutes today. So we are just scraping the surface of what we can start to talk about today. And that there's going to be a lot of information. We are going to share the recordings and share all of our materials and resources with you so that you'll be able to use some of these things and follow up with some of the links that we've included. Are we a caring campus? I think we really need to say that our community experiences conscious and unconscious bias every day. Our community experiences discrimination every day. Our community experiences systemic bias every day. We have bias. we experience bias towards us because we are all human. We play a critical role in modeling inclusive, diverse, accessible, and equitable behaviors in our community. We can ground the work that we are doing in empathy and compassion, and we can take care of each other. And some of what President Hughes talked about was about taking care of each other, especially in this COVID time. We can humanize our systems and practices in a way that does not minoritize any group or identity. We also have to acknowledge that there is a lack of diversity within our community. And it's important for us to understand that lack and where that lack is. We can overcome this by developing relationships, being empathetic to each other, being compassionate, being aware, being open, and also making sure when we're doing practices within data collecting, that our data is also open and empathetic and compassionate. So how do we create equity and inclusion together? This is something I've been thinking about a lot. This is something that I'm sure a lot of people have been thinking of, and that's why you're here, to hear what we have to say. From my perspective as an instructional designer, I have 3 practices I'm going to talk about that are not only directed at faculty and faculty practices in the classroom, but also can be adapted and used anywhere within the college, within web pages, department pages, marketing material, forms. And the first is called an inclusive statement. Inclusive statement states your openness, your willingness, your perspectives towards inclusion. It's a very powerful tool that we can use to help our students or our audiences, our users, to understand and feel like they belong in the institution, that we value their perspectives, and that we care about what they say and how they're doing. These 2 examples here, as you can see from Brown University and the University of Southern Carolina, are just 2 examples of how to include an inclusive statement within your syllabus. And we can follow up with some additional resources, particularly about inclusive statements as well, follow-up email for everyone. It's really about being open, civil, and respectful, and making sure that you're creating a safe space within your classroom, within your virtual classroom, within your department, to make sure that everyone knows that they are valued and that they belong. There's also a couple of things I'd like to talk about that I think we can do right away that would be very impactful for our students. One of them is gathering the data on how many of our textbooks that we use, how many of the English reading books that we use, how many history books that we use, our publisher data, our handbooks, lab books, all that material that we use, to make sure that those publishers have included at every level Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as LGBTQIA and authors with disability. That we make sure that we're using publishers that are WCAG AA compliant, which means that all students are able to easily access published material and use that material without any kind of length of time for remediation of documentation. I think that we can use open educational resources and textbooks, which includes people of color and LGBTQIA, and authors with disability. And when we talk about that, I'd like to show you some numbers about that. This is from 2019, 2020 isn't available yet. And this is the publishing overall, not just textbook publishing, but the publishing, which includes, Pearson, McGraw-Hill, Cengage, they're all included with this. And you can see a distinct pattern between race, gender, orientation, and disability. The more we ask our publishers for the inclusion of diverse materials, the more they will add that material. They are very cognizant of what the customer is asking for, and they are flexible and able to do that. So when we're thinking of choosing books, we're thinking about textbooks, call your publisher reps and ask them to let you know if they have included diverse voices within the material that you're reading. One of the other things we can do for materials is make sure that you allow students to include their voices as well. And I will follow up with some material on how to include student voices in your classroom. But students also have a lot of ideas about what text they would want to read, what texts they find, what articles they find from diverse perspectives and people of diversity. All those things we can do to really make a powerful impact in the classroom right away at CCRI. One of the other things I'd like to talk about very quickly is grading anonymously. Blackboard allows you both in assignments and tests to grade anonymously. You can enable it in your assignments, and in the welcome in your grading center, you can turn names off for tests. So when you grade, you do not see any names. It is a powerful practice that we can put into place right away, immediately this summer. We don't have to have anything built for us or turn anything on. It is all ready to go. We know that there is, in research, there is a strong name bias when grading in LMSs, that there's no way really to get away from that. It takes time and a lot of self-reflection to make sure that you're as unbiased as possible. So go ahead and turn those names off, at least during your first pass. I know a lot of people want to follow up with a lot of feedback, but when you do your first pass with your rubrics through your assessments, turn off those names, and it will impact immediately your grading and any kind of unconscious bias that may be slipping in there. Now I'd like to introduce Jess Wilkie. Jess?
Hi there. Hi.
Do you want me to play the video for you?
Yeah, sure. Just wanted to let everyone know that the reason why Mish is playing a video is I was in a different session at 1 o'clock. So I thought would make it consistent and do it for this one as well. And I'm going to mute it so I don't have to hear myself.
Okay, excellent.
Hi, my name is Jess Wilkie and my pronouns are she and her. I'm Director of Guided Pathways here at CCRI, and today I'll be talking to you about gender inclusivity and gender inclusive language. Over the next few minutes, we'll discuss some vocabulary around gender inclusivity, talk about personal pronouns, take a look at what this can mean for our professional practice, and wrap up by talking about learning and growing from our mistakes. First, some vocabulary. This is a much abbreviated version of the full Safe Zone Project curriculum, the entirety of which can be found at www.thesafezoneproject.com. I provide these definitions not for you to be able to label others, but so that you may understand what folks may mean when they use these terms about themselves or in one speaking to you. First is gender binary. This is the idea that there are only two genders, male and female or man and woman, and that a person must be strictly gendered as either or. This is an idea that we're working against recognizing with gender inclusive language and gender inclusivity. Gender expression is the external display of one's gender through a combination of dress, demeanor, social behavior, and other factors, generally measured on scales of masculinity and femininity. This is how someone presents themselves to the world and what that means about gender and perceptions of those around them. Gender identity is the internal perception of one's gender and how they label themselves based on how much they align or don't align with what they understand their options for gender to be. Common identity terms include man, woman, genderqueer, and non-binary, among others. So gender expression is the way we display ourselves to the world, and gender identity is our internal perception of what our gender is and what our gender is not. Biological sex. This is a medical term used to refer to the chromosomal, hormonal, and anatomical characteristics that are used to classify an individual as male or female or intersex. This is often abbreviated to simply sex, and this is assigned at birth generally. Cisgender is a person whose gender identity and biological sex assigned at birth align. For example, someone who is assigned male at birth and continues to feel that they are adequately represented by the idea of man. Transgender can mean at least two things. It's an umbrella term covering a range of identities that transgress socially defined gender norms. It can also be a person who lives as a member of a gender other than that expected based on anatomical sex. This can be someone who was assigned a gender at birth or assigned a sex at birth, but as they grew up, as they matured, they realized that their actual internalized identity, their gender identity, does not match that was assigned at birth. Non-binary is a term that someone may use for themselves if they do not identify as exclusively a man or a woman. Someone who is non-binary might feel like a mix of genders or like they have no gender at all. Pronouns are part of our vocabulary of gender as well. Common pronoun groupings are she and her, he and him, and they and them. We use they as a singular all the time, though the use of they as a singular pronoun has been a wide topic of discussion recently in social media and other social arenas. But for example, we use this all the time when referring to folks who we don't have specific information about. For example, if you see a book left behind in a classroom after class, you might say, oh, a student has left their book behind, or that student has left their book behind, if you know which student, but maybe not any more information about them. It takes a little practice, but it is possible to integrate using they and them as a singular pronoun into more aspects of our language. Now, how can this appear in our professional practice? Often this manifests in both written and oral communication. When creating documents for students or clients or customers or colleagues to complete, ask yourself, do I need a gender marker on this form? Often governmental or other legal forms do need this marker, and you will have to match what is required by that oversight committee or that overseeing organization. However, if this is something you're creating for your own purposes or an internal document, ask yourself, why do you need that information? How will the information be used? And if you do need to have a gender marker on there and you have some flexibility in what you can list as options, use non-gendered language when possible. And be sure to figure out which you're actually asking for. Are you asking for someone's sex, which refers to the hormones, chromosomes, and anatomy, or are you asking for gender, and are you asking for gender identity as personal, or do you need to reflect more legal or governmental gender terms? Using non-gendered language can also be, for example, using the term parent instead of mother or father. Avoid finite gender choices when possible. Either include multiple radio buttons for gender terms, male, female, non-binary, or other, or include an open text field where folks can enter their own gender information or gender markers. In the classroom, this often manifests in oral communication. First, introduce yourself how you would like students to introduce themselves, using the name you would prefer them to call you and your pronouns. Ask students their name and pronouns. Recognize need versus want here as well. There is not necessarily a need for you to read every name on a roster out loud in class. Of course, you will need to know which student you are referring to for attendance and grading procedures, but as far as class discussion, that has some flexibility. And when you're recognizing need versus want, ask yourself, whose comfort or safety are you focusing on at that moment? If it's for your comfort and safety, please recognize that due to the power dynamics between professors and students, this can often lead to not only discomfort, but issues of safety in the classroom for transgender or non-binary students. And practice, practice, practice. More often we get used to introducing ourselves with our preferred name and our pronouns, the more common it will become for students to do the same, and the less awkward and more second nature it will become for all of us. Some other professional tips. When giving a staff and faculty listing on a website, add pronouns to those listings. Also, list staff and faculty names as they should be used by students. This gives students a sense of belonging and a sense of personalization that they will then feel comfortable or more comfortable contacting your staff and faculty by email or by phone. Adding your pronouns to your email signature is a simple way we can acknowledge that we are paying attention to ideas of gender inclusivity and gender inclusive language. When using our remote platforms like Zoom, WebEx, Google Meet, or Microsoft Teams, change your name to reflect the name you would prefer those in the meeting call you and your pronouns. Unfortunately, in Zoom, this does mean that you will have to do this every time you enter a Zoom meeting, as it does default back to your official designation. Learning and growing from our mistakes. It happens, and it will happen less often the more we practice. However, if you do make a mistake and call someone either by a name or a gender marker that they have not told you that they prefer or that they do not use, simply apologize, let them know that you're going to keep working on it, and move on. The worst thing you can do is make a big deal out of it and further single that person out. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the workshop.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you so much. And we're gonna start right with James. And oh, I have to just jump quickly. There we go. Thank you. And James, I'd like to introduce James, and he has, as well as Jess, and if you both want to talk a little bit about what we just saw. And I know, James, you have some experiences that you'd like to share as well.
Jess, you may go ahead.
Yeah, go right ahead.
All right. So I deal a lot with the nursing students, but I sometimes deal with as they go through their course of the program. So hundreds of students over the course of several semesters. And I have found where students may have changed their name because I have to check the rosters regularly for things. I also have to generate paperwork that I have to use their legal name on. And in some cases where like my CCRI might display an attendance roster, it may only show their preferred name. And then there is a field in the Banner system for them to enter in a preferred name versus their legal name. So that's something that everyone can be aware of, that that is in there. as a field. Also, when they do make a change in terms of maybe marital status or something like that, there may be a name change. And it can happen almost, almost any time during or between semesters. I don't identify as LGBTQIA. I'm a cisgendered person but have been an ally to LGBTQIA for many years. And so I've been very conscious of doing my efforts to be inclusive and not to assume any gender or identity of someone. So I've defaulted to using they, on a daily basis. And essentially we are all allies to students. And that's something that I think everyone can be as an ally. And for the students, that would be great in helping to support their time at CCRI. What else? That's about it, I think.
Thank you, James. I know, Jess, you might want to have something to say or to wrap up your presentation.
Sure. One thing I will say is that, James, I was actually speaking with someone from the nursing department this morning, a faculty member, and we were talking about the need for a focus like this for students, and also with our faculty and staff colleagues as well. So I'm really happy to be doing this right now. And there certainly are a lot of complications around legalities and names, but I think we can always boil it down to, we don't always have to be worried about the legality of something. When we're just talking to students or when we're working within the confines of our classrooms, we certainly don't. And we can, we're intelligent people. We're here because we're educated people. We're here because we're intelligent people, and we care about students. And part of that is recognizing the complexity of identities and the intersectionality of all of our identities as well. So it takes a little bit of work, but what it takes most is effort and a willingness to grow and change your mindset around these things. And just be out on the lookout for, big feelings that you have around any of these topics we're talking about today, including gender identity, and use that opportunity. If big feelings come up, examine that within yourself and try and figure out what's at the root of those feelings for you, and whether or not that's something that needs to be, you need to work out with yourself, or maybe with your own personal communities, or if it's something that you can let rest with that discomfort and still be able to be respectful and inclusive of those around you as well. And I'm always really happy to discuss things like this, or even talk about maybe a guided or directed workshop or something around gender identity, sexual orientation, any of those things. I've done safe zone trainings for a number of years before it was even a thing, really, but also have worked a lot with GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. So if anyone's interested in doing that for a smaller group of people or a smaller office at CCRI, feel free to email me or give me a call. I'll put my email in the chat.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jess and James. I really appreciate that you shared with us all this information. And I wanted to just take a moment, thank Kevin Salisbury. He couldn't be here, tried to be here, but if you're interested to follow up, and we'll ask him maybe for some resources to include in a follow-up email around trans athletes and what's going on with coaching and trans athletes in the collegiate institutions for Rhode Island. But I would like now to turn it over to Allison.
Hello, I'm here to talk about how we can utilize inclusive language for students with disabilities. So, oh, I can't read my own slide because I have your faces, sorry. It strains credulity to assume that everyone is going to be completely bias-free. Instead, approach conversations eager to learn and willing to recognize we all come to the table with our own histories and assumptions. Acknowledge the importance of people's lived experiences by creating environments in which people feel free to express themselves. Next one. So when we're talking about language around individuals with disabilities, we have to remember language is a powerful tool. The written and spoken words that we use and the images that we create reflect our attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions. Language shapes the way those around us speak and treat one another and conveys the respect we have for others. It affects how we behave. The use of appropriate language about people with disabilities is an important tool in building a community that accepts all people. Okay, next one. So the best way to explain this is thinking of person-first language. So person first would be individual with a disability rather than handicapped person or disabled person. A student who uses a wheelchair rather than saying someone who's confined to a wheelchair. And then student with accommodations, not special student or sometimes DSS student. These are all ways that we make the human first and then about their disability, if even needed. We don't always have to talk about someone's disability either. You can go to the next one. So inclusive language regarding accommodations, having someone with accommodations in your class or you're working with someone who has a disability, always make it a collaborative approach rather than a tone or an attitude that might display that accommodations are a burden. You know, oh, that's right, I have to give you extra time for your test. Okay, I'll do that. Rather than just having a nice discussion around the accommodations with the notion that you're leveling the playing field, not that it's unfair to the rest of the class. Of course, an accommodation should never provide an unfair advantage, and DSS would work with everyone to make sure that's not the case. However, framing your mindset in terms of I'm helping the student level the playing field. The more concrete example is someone in a wheelchair. If that person doesn't have their wheelchair, they can't get to class. So if someone has an extended time or a formula bank or something like that, please know that that student needs that for their disability that might not be as visible as someone with a physical disability, but it's still about leveling the playing field. That goes also into respect. Never talk about someone's accommodation in front of the whole class. Even if it's just about the accommodation, you're still outing their disability, if you will. So that's a big thing in terms of confidentiality. And then to be truly inclusive, we should really be adapting our classroom environments to be inclusive. In this day and age, we know now we have two forms of classrooms. We have our traditional classroom and our virtual classroom. And what I mean by furniture placement in a traditional classroom is if you have a student with a physical disability that requires one of the ADA approved tables that's in the classroom, make sure that table is ready and not in the corner or not blocked by other things. So that student doesn't have to come into the classroom and ask someone to help them with that. Accommodations are in place for independence. I had a student that was in a wheelchair that was not electric. He drove himself to the night campus, got himself to the 6th floor, but at one day was not able to enter the classroom because there was a desk in the way. So his independence, all the way from driving there, from everything, was completely taken away because of the furniture. So just being mindful of, oh, I have this student in my class. Let me make sure the furniture is where it needs to be, or tell DSS they need to get help from maintenance, and because that's usually how we do it. Also, virtual platforms being accessible, being aware that captions are on for students, being aware that if you have a student who is deaf or hearing impaired in your class, that you may have an ASL interpreter. Therefore, you would have to use Zoom for your platform because that's the only one that allows an interpreter to be pinned for the student to see them while you're speaking, to be able to see the sign language. So being mindful of the adaptations that, even though, yes, the student could ask for help, but how do we make the environment ready to go for them? That's being inclusive. Okay, next slide. So I was asked to talk a little bit more specifically about mental health. That is our largest population of students with disabilities, is students with mental health illnesses or disorders. So I just have found this quote that, because I like to talk about how mental health has become colloquial almost in our own language, and it's something that I have to work on daily too. Research suggests that the majority of people hold negative attitudes and stereotypes towards people with mental illness. From a young age, children will refer to others as crazy or weird. These terms are used commonly throughout adulthood as well. Okay, next one. So I guess the point of this is to be mindful when you say things like this that are not meant to be stigmatizing. You're using them sort of as part of your everyday language, as many of us do, but they can be stigmatizing. Things like "you're so crazy," "that's crazy," "mad crazy," "that's insane," "psycho," "you're nuts," "that's nuts," "lunatic," "schizo," "deranged." So I guess adjectives is probably the most times we use that. So maybe removing that from your language or working on that is a good strategy for inclusivity around mental health. Next one. So again, going back to person first. Individual with a mental disorder, rather than "she's mentally ill," "he's bipolar." Individual living with depression, rather than "he's suffering from depression." The word suffering just implies that constantly they are plagued by depression, whereas people have depression and they live with it. They have treatment and they get accommodations. Student with a substance abuse disorder, rather than an addict. That's a, we oftentimes hear people, "oh, he's an addict, she's an addict." No, they're a person with a substance abuse disorder. So I think that's my last slide. So I want to just thank you for coming to here. And I'm certainly here with any questions around this, and certainly acknowledge that this is something everybody's working on, including myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'd like to turn it over to Kristen.
All right, so I will be presenting some data on the student diversity that we have at CCRI. So I'll be showing the whole school, and then we're going to break it down into the different campuses. Just, again, just to reinforce the idea of, everybody should be included. And as Mish talked about in the beginning, how we should be having examples of, people of color. In our lectures, we should have examples of books by people of color. This is all, to make everybody feel like they're included. And we want everyone to feel like they're included. And when they're included in the classroom, they feel more connected to the class, and they're probably likely going to stick around in the class and do better in the class. So what we have here, this is data I got from Phil Gordon. This is from fall 2019. This is our student diversity breakdown. So what you're looking at here is just a pie chart of the different percentages of the different races we see at CCRI. So in red here is white. So or the people that identify as white. 53% of the student population identifies as white. And then the rest of these categories are what I'm going to call student of colors. So just how that's further broken down. In yellow here, we have Hispanic or Latinx. That's 23% of our total population. Let's see what else we have. We have Black or African Americans in gray, 9% for our total population. And then Native Americans, Alaskan Native, this dark blue color, 4%. 6% people who identify as two or more races or biracial, multiracial. This light blue here is people who identify as other. Asian is in orange here, and then yeah, cool. So that's just the breakdown. And again, so moving forward, when we look at each campus, I'm going to just talk about the people who identify as white versus the rest is people of color. So over in Providence, what we have is only 20% of our students are white, and 80% of the student population of Providence are people of color. Okay. And then over at the Flanagan campus, it's almost 50-50. So 51% identify as white, 49% would identify as people of color. And then over the Knight campus, 60% identify as white, 40% identify as people of color. And then over in Newport, 69% identify as white. And then what would that be? 31% people of color. All right, so we have a huge, diversity at CCRI, ranging, if you think about the people of color and making sure they're included, and that's we range from 80% all the way down to 31%. So Mish said in the beginning, ways to make sure that people of color feel included are to include examples of, when you're in your lecture, of people of color, to use books written by people of color, right? Again, when students see themselves represented in the classroom, they'll feel included and more connected to the class and do better in the class.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you, Phil, for getting us the numbers for this as well. And I'd like to introduce Kevin.
Hi, everyone. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Kevin. I'm the administrative assistant to the Dean of Health and Rehab Sciences. And we're going to sort of do a real world game of how to pronounce that name. Because as we were mentioning earlier, identifying somebody by the way that they want to be identified is really important to their feelings of safety and comfort, whether that be in the classroom, virtually, or in person. If you're an advisor or a counselor, if you're meeting with people out in the real world in any circumstance, you're likely going to run into a few names here and there every now and again. So we're going to do that with my last name. My last name only has 4 letters in it, so you'd think it would be pretty easy. You'd be surprised. So there are a total of 3 ways that I have heard my last name pronounced throughout my life at CCRI and otherwise. So a generic American dialect way to pronounce my name using phonetics would be Dyiss, D-Y-E-ISS. If we're looking at a Spanish dialect, a standard Spanish dialect, it would be Diaz. And if we're looking at a Portuguese dialect, it would be Dias. And we have a very large Portuguese population in the state of Rhode Island. So Dias being more of a UH sound as opposed to an A sound. So phonetically, there are 3 very different ways to pronounce my last name, which is very small. How do you know which dialect version to use? You have maybe never heard the name pronounced. It might be a name that is difficult for you to understand how the sounds are meant to be pronounced based off of the language of origin or any other combination of things. Maybe there are some accents that maybe you don't understand what they actually mean, whether that's a cedilla underneath a C, or the squiggle that I like to call it over the N. You don't know maybe you don't know what those are, maybe you do. But the best way to know how someone wants to pronounce their name is to ask that person how to pronounce their name, because they will tell you how they want to be called. And if you find a name that is difficult to pronounce, they know that their name is difficult to pronounce over their experiences in the United States by having a roll call happen. They're not unaware of this fact. And if you get to that name and they know it's about their time to be called, you can say Mr. or Mrs. and just ignore that entirely and just say, I have a name that I don't know how to pronounce, and own up to it and say, I don't know how to pronounce this name. Please help me if you feel that this is your name, and because I want to pronounce it properly. I want the class to also hear your name so we can all pronounce it properly. And they will very likely offer up the name. And if you have multiple students who come together alphabetically, then you'll have a nice, fun, teachable, learnable moment about that experience of having a difficult name and what that is for them. So that's an important thing to remember, is that on top of what their name is on that sheet of paper, hearkening back to Jess's presentation, maybe that's not the name they want to be called. Maybe they have a nickname. Maybe they're coming to terms with a gender identity that is not currently available through the Banner system. There could be any number of things that could affect what their name is on that piece of paper. So when in doubt, ask. And if it's a simple name, like my first name, Kevin, and someone says, actually, I prefer to go by Kev, or I prefer to go by my last name as my first name, do that. Make a note of it. Put it on your sheet of paper, or try to work on it when you have them in class, when you're calling on them or asking them to present, or whatever it is that you do and how you interact with students or individuals. For my last name, it gets a little complicated because in American dialect, that is the name that I tend to give people, Dyiss, because that seems to be the easiest. I am not of Spanish descent, so Diaz is incorrect, which I get a lot of people saying that, which I understand they're trying to be respectful, but in being respectful, they're actually being incorrect. I am Portuguese. My last name is Diaz. But growing up, I knew, based off of my parents being immigrants and their interactions with other Americans, that Diaz was saved for our cultural peers. It was a Portuguese thing only, which I sort of picked up on and gave Dias as my name moving forward to all of my colleagues and classmates and other people in my life, unless I knew they were Portuguese. So for me, I accept Dias. Dias is acceptable as well, but for consistency, I say Dias, and I ask other people to say Dias as well, because Dias is sort of a thing that we keep personal, keep very familial and very close to us. And that is something that I ask people to respect. If you want to do it to be correct, I appreciate that, but it's not necessary for you to make that choice for me. And I respect when other people do follow my lead and say Dias as opposed to Diaz or Diaz. How to include dialect or how to have it be a thing that is important in your classroom. Specifically when it comes to GradWalk, I know that there were some comments earlier in the previous session about GradWalk. Mish, if you want to go over to the next slide. These apps and also Google Translate will allow at least some sort of nominal knowledge about how to pronounce someone's name. Take it with a grain of salt. It might not be correct based off of vernacular or dialect or region, country of origin, having very similar last names like mine, Spanish and Portuguese, very similar, but sound very different. So take these apps, Name Coach Names, Name Shouts, and Google Translator with a grain of salt if you use that for someone's first, middle, or last name. When in doubt, ask. And if you forget, ask again. And this website, mynamemyidentity.org, has a lot of resources and a lot of information about the importance of getting someone's name correct and pronouncing it properly, and how that affects someone's feeling of safety and comfort in your classroom, and how that can not only make them feel better, but also help them improve their work and their self-worth while they're with you and have time with you. So thank you. That's my little bit. So you can call me Kevin Dias.
Thank you, Kevin Dias. Thank you, everyone, for presenting today. I can't thank you enough for joining me, all the speakers today. Thank you so much. We do have some time for question and answers, but right before we do that, I'd like to share with you a national resource for your classes and for your departments. And this is for students, faculty, staff, administration. All of us can begin to make sure that we have these available in our spaces where we work for people who may need it. We will also include all of this, these links and information in a follow-up email to all of you who have attended with a link to the recording, and so that you can sort of spread this into our spaces at CCRI and make sure that we have this available to anybody that may be struggling. And now we enter into Q&A. I can stop sharing. Anyone who has a question, please just raise your hand. We're all of the speakers here are glad to share our experience with you, and anything you may want to know further. You can also type into the chat as well.
And we're getting lots of comments thanking the presenters, which is wonderful. We're happy to be here. And also an apology, Kevin, to you about mispronunciation of names. So that's always nice as well.
Excellent. Fabulous. Well, if there's no questions, then we can wrap this up. We're always available. I hope this introduction will lead us to more webinars, workshops like this, where we can talk in depth. Again, we're just barely scratching the surface of really what the work we can do here at CCRI, and just go in compassion and empathy and spread the word. Thank you, everyone.